Well, Langdale's a brilliant place to come to talk about the Lake District and the evolution of the Lake District as a discrete geographic region. There are 13 major valleys in the Lake District, and all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, follow Langdale's lead in how it's developed over the past 1,000 years. The landscape that you can see behind me started to be enclosed around about 1,000 years ago, after the Norman conquest, as the victorious Norman lords and barons took land for themselves, settled it with tenants who could pay them a rental income and would begin to farm the land and make it productive. Around about the same time, large areas were being given to some of the larger monastic houses. They were running those lands commercially as cattle ranches, sheep ranches, or arable mixed farms. And some of the evidence of that, particularly the large enclosure walls that sit around the valley bottom, establishing that very simple infield outfield system, enclosing the valley bottom meadows from the upland grazing on the commons and the valley sides, is something that underpins all Lake District landscapes and Lake District farming. Within a few hundred years, those tenants were beginning to nibble extra pieces of land from the common on the valley sides and enclosing lands for their own use in small fields called intakes. That wave of intaking took place between about 1300 and 1600. And by 1800, the last of the field walls on the valley sides and the valley tops, often the ones that are ruler straight, were being added through private agreement or Act of Parliament. And the landscape that we see was largely intact by about 1850. The white painted farmhouses and agricultural buildings, they were there too. They probably date from about 1600 to 1750. Certainly the majority of them in Langdale do. So the landscape that we see today retains an awful lot of its authenticity from 200 years ago. Commoning's a really important feature and cultural phenomenon of the Lake District. The communal management of the commons and the communal management of the valley bottoms are very much essential requirements for the Lake District traditional farming system. These are farms in marginal areas. The margins are very slim, and if you don't cooperate, work together and pool your resources with your neighbours, then farming ceases to become viable in these areas. So certain things simply need to be done en masse. Gathering your sheep from the huge areas of unenclosed common can't be done by individual farms. It needs to be done by groups, valley groups, with large teams of people going up en masse, collecting everyone's sheep, bringing them down, and then subdividing them and sorting them out on the valley bottom. So I think Langdale is probably one of the valleys where we would have seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of Atlantic oak woodland cover from about 4000 BC. It was around that time that Neolithic communities started to procure stone to make stone axes. Just over my right shoulder, up on the high fells there, are Europe's largest prehistoric stone axe factory. So for a period of about 700 years, from about 4000 BC to about 3300 BC, this was the centre of the Neolithic universe. I think the Neolithic axes from Great Langdale were fairly ubiquitous to most British Neolithic communities. It was the tool for most jobs that needed doing about 4000 BC. They turn up in all sorts of contexts: domestic sites, burial sites, casual discards, in watery places, ritual deposition, all the way across the British Isles, and certainly find their way into Ireland and even across to mainland Europe. They clearly had a function beyond the functional. These were significant, possibly ritual objects that had strong associations with individuals, had strong associations with place, and that you were trading the meaning and the potency of that association as those axes changed hands. So I'm standing about midway down the Langdale Valley at the moment, and just behind me are the Cocktail boulders. The rock art motifs that appear on the surface of the rock are quite unlike anything else that's found within the Lake District National Park. There were an awful lot of potentially very interesting loose ends that could be tied up at Cocktail, associations with Irish megalithic tombs, associations with rock art, and associations with stone procurement and axe manufacturing. And one way to find out more is obviously to start digging holes in the ground. And it demonstrated that the rock art motifs go below the current ground level, and two new motifs, a large group of concentric circles and a lovely arcing bow of parallel lines, were found below the turf line. The other thing that was of interest was that halfway up the line of the excavated trench was a deliberately compacted layer of stone, and underneath that layer of rammed stone was the Neolithic ground surface, and sitting on top of that Neolithic ground surface were four stone implements laying side by side, a little bit like toast soldiers. So in this box, which I've got to be very careful with, are four pieces of stone that were recovered from that Neolithic ground surface, and I've got to be careful with them because I've borrowed them back from the excavators who are yet to do their post-excavation analysis of these objects. But effectively what we have are four stone chisels. Each one has a flattened striking plane. You can imagine striking that end with a round river cobble, and the other end is certainly more pointed, and analysis under the microscope will show if that pointed end shows evidence of stress fracturing and impacting upon the rock. But experimental archaeology shows that tools, very simple tools like these, very effective. These sort of stone chisels are almost self-sharpening, because as they become worn, they begin to fragment, they fracture, that creates new sharp edges. So there's always one face of it that you can use as a chisel. Sitting alongside these three stone chisels is another object that's of a slightly different type and design. This is part of a river cobble that has been struck and fractured to create this gouge or pointed scraper, I suppose. Now, I can't imagine you do an awful lot of chipping away of hard stone surfaces with that, but you could imagine it being used to mark out the designs, to scratch them into the rock, or it might have a completely different function. You could imagine using that as a leather gouge, or I'm sure it's got 101 uses if you're a Neolithic person and that's forming part of your toolkit. So I'm very excited about this further analysis taking place, because hopefully that will demonstrate and reveal once and for all whether these are the very tools that were used 6,000 years ago by people to create the motifs just behind me, and the discovery of actual tools upon the site of the rock art itself is incredibly rare in a British context. Well, I was delighted when the Lake District was successful with its bid for World Heritage status. I'm delighted that it was inscribed. I think it's a surprise that it took so long, really. I think the Lake District is a globally significant landscape. It's certainly Britain's most cherished landscape, I think, without any doubt whatsoever. And it is a place that's beauty gives it global significance. The Lake District will continue to change and evolve, and I see one of the benefits of being inscribed as a World Heritage Site is that it is underlined and very clearly articulated exactly why the Lake District is significant on a global level. And I think as we face into uncertain times at the start of the 21st century, understanding that significance will help us to make the right decisions and manage that change to the benefit of the Lake District in the future.